Hey, Jordan, how's it going?
Hey, Rob, what's up?
I'm feeling really good. I mean, it's like we really have been working overtime over the last couple of months, and it's really, it's so satisfying when you spend time on a project and you see it start to come to fruition. You see it starting to, it starts as an idea, you're taking notes, you're having meetings, and then you slowly see it turn into like a real tangible thing, something that people can see and experience. I mean, that's why I got into this business. I love it. It's just a great feeling.
Yeah. No, you're telling me. I feel really fulfilled. Pretty excited. We've had a lot of long nights. Some people doubted us along the way. Hi, haters. But here we are.
Yeah. And so that reality show, The Activist, I saw the first commercial. I thought it was very inspiring. That whole pitch process of pitching that and creating that was so difficult. So it was really great to see that, start to see people start to experience that. I've been pretty busy with other stuff. I didn't really check into like the reaction from online. I'm sure it was really positive, but I haven't really looked into it much. But either way, I'm happy to see it start to turn into a real thing.
Yeah. Well, we tried to gear it toward kind of the online activists too. So I can't imagine it would backfire.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone was really into it.
Yeah, the scoring mechanism to kind of determine who is the best activist and quantifying their performance in terms of post-performance, I just think that's a no-brainer. Who is going to take issue with that? Yeah,
I'm pretty sure. I'll check into it later, but I'm pretty sure everyone is really into that idea. And so that's just really exciting. Of course, it was 9/11. It was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And that was the other thing that I was kind of really distracted by this week. And once again, I mean, we've talked about this before, but seeing George W. Bush's speech at the event commemorating the United 93 crash just reminded me once again that, this guy, George W. Bush, obviously, I didn't always agree with what he did, the things that he said, but again, just a pure class act. And I really just did I found myself getting quite emotional yesterday watching this George W. Bush speech. And I got to say, I kind of missed the guy,
Talk about leadership. From people like him to Giuliani, we all remember where we were on 9/11 and the weeks and months afterward. And just, it was kind of like a flashback. We think back to that somber day. And now here we are 20 years later with a fabled, stoic leader reflecting on an attack on all of us, really, an attack on our freedoms. And, I don't really remember kind of what happened after that or in between.
No.
I'm sure everything was fine. But, it's great to see him back in the spotlight because that's the kind of leadership we need back at the helm in this country.
I often thought about it during the Donald Trump administration, the way that like America really needed that kind of moral conservative leadership, not just from George W. Bush, but the whole crew. I really found myself missing them. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Ashcroft, Condoleezza Rice, all these people.
Bring them back. Bring them all back.
They should. I mean, that's maybe something that Biden could take a look at. I don't know if he wants to expand his cabinet or wants to even reach out to the more sensible, moderate conservatives like them. That could be something that they could kind of take a look at, maybe in a second term kind of situation.
That's an administration that'll heal the nation.
Yeah, and I guess the really disappointing thing was seeing people kind of joking around, online, engaging in sort of conspiratorial stuff. Really, really unfortunate to see people still, 20 years later, making these kinds of offensive claims. Dude, was quite upsetting.
Especially at a time like this, we're ending the Afghanistan war. We went in, we kicked ass. It's the American way. And the audacity of people to suggest that really the Saudis were behind it the entire time. Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. And who cares if John Ashcroft started flying private in July 2001? I mean, we fly private all the time. It's very comfortable. It's not a big deal. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. I just want to actually check which episode it is.
It's episode 69.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome, everyone. It's actually episode 78 of The Insurgents. Welcome. Welcome, everybody.
What's up?
What is up? Are you asking me or are you asking like the audience?
I don't know.
Yeah. Not much is up with me, if that's what you were asking. Are you watching some sports ball today? I know it's big NFL day.
Of course. Yeah, this is the best day of the year because it's the furthest away from the end of the season. It's great. Where we still on a day where we still have football, it's great. So the first Sunday, kickoff Sunday is fantastic. Had Red Zone on all day. My beloved Cleveland Browns did not win, which is not really surprising because they've lost the opener like 14 years in a row now. So
aren't they supposed to be really good this year though?
Yeah. They just don't win openers. It's really weird.
It's kind of a rope-a-dope thing. Maybe they're just lulling everyone into a false sense of security. Maybe
in classic Browns fashion, they held the lead the entire game and then gave it away at the end. So that's how my Sunday went. But last night I watched this movie called Malignant. It's on HBO Max. I don't know. From my friends in Ontario tell me there's like different movie release things. Like you guys don't always get them right away. Do you have access to this movie? Malignant?
We don't actually have movies here.
You don't have electricity?
Exactly. No, it might be on HBO. I don't know. I don't have HBO Go.
I just remember there was an HBO Max movie where a buddy in Ontario said that he wasn't going to be able to get it for a few weeks because
maybe it was the Snyder
release. Maybe it might.
I saw you bitching about this movie though. Is it not?
It fucking sucked, dude. Yeah. Yes, and like now I got all the film guys upset because I said it was the worst movie I've watched in a few years, and all these people who's
Twitter.
like,
that's not good.
Yeah, the people who've like made their personality watching movies like are really upset. It's like, haha, this is what somebody who only watches 3 movies a year thinks, and it's like, well, actually, it's probably closer to 2. So, joke's on you, pal. Yeah. No, I like James Wan, and I wanted to watch it because I like what he does, and I like his cinematography, and I like some of the shots that he does, and on in that respect, it was fantastic. And people were like, "Well, he was just trying to do a campy horror movie," and yes, I saw that, but it was also really poorly executed, and that's what sucks. This idea that people who don't like it didn't understand what he was doing is so frustrating because it's like, yeah, I understand campy horror and I like it when it's done well. Like Sam Raimi's really good at that, but this just wasn't done well. Like James Wan does like more. I don't know how to describe a movie like The Conjuring, which I thought was really fucking good and I loved it a lot. And it had the aesthetic of a movie like that, but some of the execution and delivery of some of the lines were just, they fell so flat. The acting was terrible. The music didn't really seem to fit. I don't know. And the plot was just kind of ludicrous. Not that all horror movies make sense, but this was just kind of like comical. By the end I was laughing. If you want a good comedy, check out Malignant.
Well, it seems divisive because I checked this out with this post and you had a lot of people agreeing with you wholeheartedly and a lot of people like vehemently disagreeing. So it seems like, seems very divisive. I don't know. I'll check it out and I'll see if your review holds up.
I can't do film stuff. I just don't care enough.
Yeah.
It's just not something I'm passionate about. I will watch, I'm pretty picky about the movies I watch, but that's like it. I don't really care if anyone else likes something a lot or dislikes something a lot. That doesn't impact what I think about it. But people just like lose their minds if you don't like the movie that they have decided is good. It's weird.
I've been rewatching Lost. Were you a Lost guy?
No.
I was really, really obsessed with it when it was on TV and ended up being very disappointed in the ending to the point that it kind of negatively colored my entire enjoyment of the entire series, which I spent many years being really into and researching all the theories and looking up frame by frame the scenes to try and find all the different clues and stuff. I was really one of those guys. But I have been enjoying rewatching it. Those first couple of seasons are really excellent. And, we talked about September 11th. Like, there's been kind of a conversation around some of like the American pop culture post September 11th and how, we can see how it cast this really wide shadow over a lot of everything that was going on in sort of American film and TV. And Lost, I think, is kind of underrated in terms of its kind of post 9/11 cultural imprint. But I really did enjoy those first couple of seasons. I've been having fun rewatching it, and it's kind of nice to rewatch it while not getting too caught up in, you know, all the mysteries and stuff, and kind of just trying to enjoy all the twists and turns as it happens. That's been kind of fun. That's been kind of fun lately. So on the podcast today, folks, we've got Adam Johnson of Citations Needed and the column on Substack. Really awesome conversation with Adam. And, you know, Citations Needed and the work that Adam does really, what I think covers really well the way that, you know, mainstream media in the US especially functions, and how the media kind of creates these narratives and what the purpose of these narratives are, and, you know, how the media especially uses language in order to sort of, you know, create consent to tell these certain stories. It's really, really vital sort of media analysis that he does. So he was really able to, it was really great to have him come on and break down a lot of the way that the media has functioned, like in the post 9/11 period. You know, recently when it comes to the Afghanistan withdrawal, in terms of the economic stuff, the so-called labor shortage and everything like that, which we've heard a lot about in the media. Really good conversation with Adam. He's going to be joining the show in just a couple of minutes. Before Adam gets here, though, Jordan, this didn't come up in the conversation. I just wanted to get a few quick thoughts from you, because we've talked about this a little bit over the last couple of weeks, right? About the progressive members of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Cori Bush, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and how they've taken a lot of sort of criticism by people on this in this sort of online left, for not really wielding the power that they have to, you know, possibly sink legislation if they need to make things better, or to not like fight for things that people really care about. And I do sort of understand a little bit of that criticism, certainly. And now it seems like there is kind of a showdown forming where over these infrastructure bills, where you have Joe Manchin saying, you know, he supports the bipartisan one, and will not support the much more ambitious and much more, you know, bold infrastructure package that they're hoping to pass through reconciliation. It's set up this showdown where you have Manchin saying he's not going to vote for that, and now you finally do have AOC saying, no, we're not going to pass this legislation if that's what it comes down to. So I guess this is my question for you before Adam joins us. What do you think is going to happen from this showdown? Do you think that they're going to stick to their guns? Do you think that they are really willing to sink this legislation if it comes down to it? You know, we know that is going to have a ton of political fallout if they end up doing that. So what do you think? Do you think that they're going to stick to their guns? Are they going to cave? How do you see this coming showdown over infrastructure playing out?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm confident enough to make a prediction, because I think there's a few things moving. So in the House, you've got a couple blue dogs trying to obstruct and slow it down there, and you really only have a few votes to lose in the House. And then you have Manchin and Sinema in the Senate, who also are just total rats. Now, Manchin just said today on one of the Sunday morning shows that he's going to vote no on a $3.5 trillion package. You need both of those votes to do it on the 3.5, because it's a go it alone type thing. If that happens, I don't know what impact that has on 2022, because this is probably the only big piece of legislation Biden's going to be able to pass. Because when they come back, maybe something in the fall, I have no idea what that's going to look like. Maybe something at the end of the year, try to squeeze something in. But next year, it's going to be all campaigning. It's going to be, you're going to see very little done in Congress because it's going to be so politically charged because of midterms. So this is like really the only moment you can do something big and ambitious. And then that's what they're going to have to run on in 2022. So any sort of compromise, and you have progressive saying the 3.5 trillion already is a compromise.
Yeah, it's like you have Manchin saying that, like, though that's the ceiling, and we've got room to negotiate. And then you have some people like Rashida Tlaib saying, like, no, it's the floor. Like that's
Clyburn
the floor.
Is saying 3.5 is the ceiling, which like this guy's the fucking kingmaker apparently, and it's like remarkable that you have people, and for him, like he's third in command in the House Dems, to undercut their own party like that. It shows just how deep and pervasive corporate influence is in the Democratic Party.
Like Biden campaigned on all this shit. That's the amazing thing to me. It's like it's literally their agenda that they campaigned on. They've got their own parties being like, whoa, hey, let's not go too far here.
Yeah. So I'm also like frustrated by people who for years have alleged that people like Sanders, AOC, Tlaib, Ilhan, and the rest of like the more progressive members are working against Democratic Party priorities. So this is, like you're saying, this is a Democratic Party priority. This is what Biden wants to do. This is what Pelosi wants to do. And this is what Schumer wants to do. And the progressives are in lockstep on this to pass it. And the people that aren't are the blue dogs, the moderates, the people who resemble a political makeup or a political ideology that the consultant class, the analyst class, and the pundit class insist is the best way forward for the Democratic Party. And they will champion these people over progressive alternatives to the Democratic Party's own detriment, as we're seeing play out now. So I hope if this somehow does not happen, God forbid, that people take a lesson from this and to never fucking trust any of this type of bullshit blue dog centrist myth making ever again. Because when it comes down to it, look what's happening across the board. You've got progressives in lockstep on this, and you have the DSA even whipping votes against the recall in California. Imagine going back 2 years and saying and telling yourself this. Like, yeah, it would be unbelievable, but that's what's happening because people understand how the system works. And people in the progressive left understand there's much more to be gained with a $3.5 trillion package than a bipartisan compromise that'll probably perpetuate some of the worst elements of climate change.
Yeah. And it's just, it's amazing too, this like hand wringing about how it's way too expensive and stuff. It's not like there's been any serious crises lately, like that happening that could possibly, this would, respond to some of this stuff. I don't know. It is amazing. It's amazing the way that they're totally willing to just torpedo their own agenda. And like, again, AOC pointed out in this video she did the other day, it's not like these things are even unpopular in these people's districts many of the time. Like, they're actually popular. It's not like, oh, I have to vote against this or else I'm going to be voted out. Like, it's quite the opposite. But that's how married they are to this idea of like just enforcing this kind of austerity budget, even when all signs indicate that like you need to respond to with something else. But anyway, I'm interested to see how it plays out. It's going to be really interesting to see how that happens and how it plays out in the media and how everyone responds to it. Let's get to our conversation with Adam, though, now. Adam Johnson's going to be joining the show in just a minute. Again, really great talk. Really appreciate the work that Adam does. He's going to be joining the show right after this. We're joined by Adam Johnson. Adam, of course, the co-host of the podcast Citations Needed, very excellent podcast. Also of The Column on Substack, new Substack guy. Adam, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Are you going to become one of these like Substack contrarians now? Is it in your contract that once you start getting involved in that, you have to start? You're going to start going on Tucker Carlson and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, it's funny. The 5 seconds of having a Substack, or really, I think any media, you definitely realize why people make heel turns to the right. It's a fucking cash cow. I mean, and the sort of liberal, vaguely left person turn road to Damascus who sees the light and starts dunking on the libs is definitely a clear path towards subs, for sure.
Seems like it, yeah. I haven't cracked it yet because I dunk on the libs all the time, and I'm still... very not successful.
Dunking on the libs from the left, and there's dunking on the libs as an ideology in and of itself, which very quickly becomes just right wing, right?
Yeah, Jordan, do you want to hit Adam with the big question to get us started off here?
Oh my God, of course, Adam. So we start all of these conversations the same way. Yes. We don't like to let people off the hook.
I'm on the hot seat.
Yeah. So it's the same fastball question, right down the middle. Just know who they are, who we're dealing with. Adam, are you a gamer?
I'm not a gamer. I have, I think, an Xbox, I don't know what it's called. And I occasionally would play with a friend of mine in San Antonio. We would play MLB The Show.
Yeah.
That kind of counts.
So, no, I'm not a gamer. Why? Are y'all gamers? Is this a gamer show I'm on? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we do pro gamer activism here.
Okay. Well, hopefully I'm not alienating your base.
No.
No, I think that still counts, though. I think I'm going to allow it.
You've held a controller account, so you're allowed to continue.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, I'm not. Yeah, I don't. I'm too busy, writing the great American novel and painting a self-portrait and building a house and doing sit-ups and reading.
And activism, of course.
And helping old ladies cross the street. I don't have time for that frivolity.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. I'm a degenerate. I just play Fortnite and Magic the Gathering, so.
I hope you two had a good 9/11. How was your 9/11? Not bad?
The best, Rob.
Yeah.
It was okay. It's sad. I was reading about. I watched one of those schmaltzy Fox things today on the New York Fire Department football team, which lost I think 22 out of 50 something people that day. Because they lost 343 firemen that day. It was a lot of firemen. Entire I guess not departments is the term used, but were wiped out. And I was reading about the firemen who died. Very sad. I'm not ironic about 9/11. I do think one of the things I think a lot about, which maybe we can talk about. I don't know. Should I just pontificate here?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, one of the things I was thinking a lot about this last few weekends is how do you draw the line? There's this very blurry line between legitimate grief and remembrance and jingoistic propaganda, and every single one of these sort of stories you read, especially on television. It sort of starts off and you're like, wow, that's a lot of people who died, or this is very sad, or this person lost this loved one, and it's very precious, and it's very, it's very, very vulnerable, very, very real. I mean, even though it's been 20 years, it's still, 3,000 people died in a couple hours. It's a big, mass death event. And then it sort of starts to merge into kind of flag waving, saying, then we all united, which of course has a sort of political loaded concept that is obviously very contestable to those who were affected by the sort of what that uniting entailed with respect to invading Afghanistan or hate crimes against Muslims, or the kind of jingoistic fervor, the snuffing out of the globalization, the anti-globalization movement, other left-wing movements. So it's such a fine line, because you'll sort of watch these segments or you'll sort of read these articles about people who suffered, and you sort of, your heart goes out because it's very real. And then suddenly there's this sort of tacked on political commentary, and it's so hard to even know where that line is, and it's so hard to divorce grief from because it's that grief is such an important antecedent to the political projects of the U.S. empire since 9/11, right? That it's so hard to divorce the two. And I'm even sort of curious, because I think in some senses the left has kind of done two things to kind of cope with that. They've either been very ironic about 9/11, people make a lot of jokes or this, or Bush did 9/11 kind of stuff, or they do the kind of, well, what about all those 148,000 people who died in Afghanistan, which is fine and all, but I don't think really speaks to the kind of basic need to focus, or to sort of at least once a year. I don't think we need to focus on it all the time, but at least once every 5 years, one day every 5 years seems reasonable to sort of grief that in and of itself. But how do you even do that without fueling these forces? I don't know. I'm this is a think piece. I don't actually have a good take here. I find that
right.
I find that hard to navigate.
So you don't think CNN journalists were the real heroes of the day that we should all be thankful for? Brian Stetler was saying this, I think, on CNN.
Oh wait, what he loves to talk about how brave journalists are, and sanctioned journalists.
Yeah.
If they're AP journalists in Gaza, they have it coming. If they're J20 journalists who are facing 7 years in federal prison, they have it coming. But if they're their buddies at CNN or other corporate media outlets who are not being bombed by Israel, then. But what did he say with respect to the?
Oh, let me just quickly check.
He's ostensibly a media reporter, but has absolutely zero substantive things to add, which is a really hard job to do. If I had to do media criticism but never had anything of substance to add, but had to fill up space an hour a day, 5 days a week, I would have a hard time doing that.
Yeah.
But,
no,
so what he does is he reverts to this kind of very vague, aren't journalists the real hero stuff all the time.
Yeah. No, he retweeted a post, or a story from AP News, and he said network TV anchors were, quote, the closest thing that America had to national leaders on 9/11. They were the moral authority for the country on that first day.
Yeah, sure.
Especially with the political leaders in bunkers or otherwise out of sight.
Yeah, why not? There are people rushing to ground zero to pull people out of the rubble, but it was Tom Brokaw.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. I was really you're right to point out that like that should be something that we should really celebrate the heroism that took place. I saw that picture of, I think, Ladder 118. There's this famous picture.
Yeah.
Crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, and just every single person on the truck was killed that day.
Yeah, no, it's nuts because they just ran into the building. They ran, that's, where I think something like maybe 20, 30 something police officers. Not, I don't want to take this time to ACAB, but like basically like that's not really their job to sort of run into places where that's literally firemen's job.
Yeah,
or fire people rather, and they did, and it fucking collapsed, and they wiped out, again, whole ladders, whole departments or whatever the sort of appropriate term is.
No, but you're right though. It is tricky to find the balance between like taking that seriously and not participating in this kind of grotesque spectacle that it's turned into.
Yeah, it's especially when you have Bush going out there and again, it's like it's almost impossible to sort of strip it of its imperial context, because it's sort of America, especially at the 2001, it's sort of this lone superpower. It's kind of the same problem, to put it crudely. It's the same problem that like the screenwriters of 24 had, which is how do you make an empire look like an underdog? With this vast, unparalleled. So you have this kind of specter of terrorism where the kind of randomness of the attack and the brutality of it gives you a sort of moral sense of an underdogism. And you saw this when we invaded Afghanistan. There was, America likes to view itself as an underdog almost to the person. And when you have such overwhelming force, it's like, how do you frame yourself that way? Especially when so many people kind of wanted it to be this, greatest generation, World War II. We were all coming off the high of Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, which premiered 2 days before 9/11. There was this sense of like, we're now going to have a new greatest generation. But you sort of get there, and it's a bunch of like extremely poor people, and they're kind of hiding in caves, and it's not really clear who finances them. And Saudi Arabia may or may not be involved. And the whole thing sort of doesn't really seem as clear as people wanted it to be.
One thing that I have noticed as well, though, and this is something that's been, I think, pervasive, especially like in the years preceding, immediately afterwards, this kind of real effort on the part of a lot of sort of serious liberal journalists, such as Chris Hayes, who tweeted about this recently, to really shut down anyone actually like questioning the official narrative that's been presented about what actually happened. I don't want to get like too into the weeds on that. I don't want to get anyone canceled.
Sure.
But it was kind of interesting, isn't it? And it seems like there's this kind of taboo about questioning these things, and pushing back against this official narrative about September 11th that's been created, that's been upheld by things like the 9/11 Commission. It seems like that taboo is kind of broken a little bit, and now it's starting to become a lot more normalized to have people start to be like, hey, like maybe we should be asking some of these very critical questions, considering the way this event has been used to justify like 20 straight years of so much destruction and violent imperialism and military spending and crackdown on civil liberties and all this stuff. Like it is interesting, and it's like, what do you make of that? This whole this effort on the part of a lot of serious journalists to really ostracize anyone that was sort of asking these kind of critical questions about this.
Well, I mean, like with anything involving these emotionally charged like historical events, it's hard to know the balance, because on the one hand, certain quote unquote conspiracy theories can fuel anti-Semitism, like that's very much a thing. It can fuel sort of misplaced paranoia or distrust in institutions that maybe is not justified. At the same time, especially with respect to Saudi involvement, like in the redactions or the preventing of lawsuits and the indemnification of the Saudi government and the 9/11 victims' families. You had at one point in 2016, 2017, all 5 major editorial boards in the United States, the Washington Post, New York Times, USA Today, all came out and as well as the Obama administration suing the government, suing Saudi Arabia over 9/11. Even though countries like Iran, by the way, have been sued for 9/11 because they sort of generically supported terrorism, even though, of course, nobody credibly makes the claim that they themselves did 9/11. So you have this sort of ally of the U.S. who's kind of tangentially or directly involved. A lot of unknown questions there. I think that's kind of a major vector for a lot of people who maybe aren't taken into these things normally to be like, well, that is kind of strange, and it makes sense because we know that this, obviously most of the hijackers were Saudi. We know that Bin Laden's Saudi. We know that there's supposedly, there's a break between them, but also there's a lot of financial links. But I mean, it's natural for people to ask questions. I don't really have a strong opinion about it. I think sometimes going down certain rabbit holes can have problems. With respect to like, you have to we should have an accurate and sober reading of of the world itself. But certainly the ideological gatekeeping around conspiracy theories is something of interest to me. I mean, you see that a lot, even with things that are kind of banal.
Yeah, it does seem kind of like sometimes that people get put into certain camps as well. And like, that's a whole conspiracy in and of itself, is whether you think that certain people like in this kind of wacko conspiracy world are possibly, playing a certain role specifically to delegitimize like real questions that people might have.
Conspiracy theory is a pejorative label that is basically a career ender. Nobody ever wants to be called a conspiracy theorist.
I think it's really interesting to think about the way that mainstream media, all over the world, obviously in America predominantly, but all over the world, shifted into this like very hyper militaristic mode right after September 11th, of course, and really went into complete overdrive in creating this narrative and manufacturing this consent for what we've now been through, what America's been through over this 20-year period of all kinds of like really brutal, sadistic violence in many cases. And one thing that was kind of interesting to me is I really started to get that kind of feeling about the media over the last couple of weeks of this Afghanistan withdrawal, as that's been kind of coming to a close. And I feel like they kind of switched that, they flipped that switch back on in the last couple of weeks. And you did a great job of covering a lot of this stuff, the way that these supposedly objective journalists who often lecture people about, being objective and not doing advocacy journalism, just completely dropped all pretense of having any kind of objectivity over the last couple of weeks as they felt this war coming to an end and really felt like they were kind of throwing their bodies on the tracks to prevent this.
Yeah, well, it's one of the sort of clever things about quote unquote objective journalist ideology that's shoved down people's throats in J school, though there's exceptions to that, is that like there are certain things that exist outside of quote unquote politics, and to a large extent empire, or the sort of general premises of empire, the U.S., the civic religion of the U.S. is a moral arbiter of human rights, the U.S. is a kind of beacon of freedom, that historically these things, and this goes back decades, that these things are kind of beyond politics, that there's sort of consensus, like you would have a consensus around climate change or gravity, right, or the theory of evolution, right? It's kind of an accepted reality that that the basic premise of U.S. empire, that we're the sort of morally preferable global police, is not really contestable. It's not even really considered ideological. It's like the universal constant or gravity. It's just this thing, right? That's exists and has always existed, and it's just the way it is. And with Afghanistan, it was an extremely unusual circumstance where the president, for various reasons, I think probably the most urgent being is that it's very popular, north of 75% popularity, decided to say, well, I'm not going to be extorted, because I think this was a shock, to a lot of people that even on the left, that he actually sort of withdrew the troops. Now, obviously, they're keeping drones and those horrible things, so that by no means is the war over. But the military pullout was a meaningful de-escalation, and we know it was meaningful because the blob had a fucking month-long meltdown over it. And that civic religion of American empire was this is sort of a rare occasion where the president kind of bucked to that national security establishment, which, by the way, I'm told does not exist by several people, except the fact that 99% of them all have the exact same opinion.
There is no mafia.
Yeah, exactly. There is no mafia. It was an illustrative, from a media criticism standpoint, it was a bunny slope, right? It was the chip shot, whatever you sort of choose your metaphor, because they were uniformly all having basically the same meltdown, and there are systemic and ideological reasons why that is. We can get into, but it was an object lesson in sort of how these things, how the media, quote unquote media, the sort of generalized media, can discipline politicians and presidents who are seen as being off script from what is considered the kind of axiom of American imperial kind of right, that it's kind of our right to do these things. We saw this real kind of breathless moralizing, editorializing from people like Peter Baker, Jake Tapper, Richard Engel, who I honestly thought was going to have some kind of breakdown. I mean, he was just losing it. The only closest example I could think of was all the debt scolding of Obama. Like that was Obama mostly got a free ride to a great extent as well, because he was very kind of center right. But then they got a little bit loosey-goosey, even though the rhetoric didn't reflect this. They got loosey-goosey with the holiest of the holies, right? The only thing holier than the troops is the deficit, right?
Yeah, I remember if this was your family budget, this is what it would look like. Those kind of things.
Meltdown. I mean, the usual. That's how Jake Tapper made his career when he was at ABC. He would sit there and scold Jake Carney about the deficit. And that's sort of a similar example, because that's less holy these days, just by the necessity, because they had to say fuck that after the recession in March of 2020. There's no way you could get around that. But it's sort of similar. Like it's disciplining liberal presidents, which is what you have to do. You have to make sure that they don't veer off the script.
I think on the Biden point, a lot of people probably shudder to do this on the left, just out of purity politics or whatever, but admit that this was the right thing for Biden to do, to pull out of Afghanistan, I wouldn't say admit defeat, but at least recognize that the operation that they were still conducting was a failed one. And that made national security analysts kind of shudder and recoil. We have an overreaction now from the center, and especially center right and beyond. You see Lindsey Graham already clamoring to reinvade. And as much as I don't really personally care for the guy, I think this was something that was politically popular enough for Biden to do it, and he recognized that they needed to do this in the long run. What I don't see, however, is a recognition in the media that this is part of a larger foreign policy shift toward China and Russia. Yes. And everyone wants to say this, the forever war is over. We've ended the forever war. And we see this play out in the progressive left. Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, how this is, while he's getting applause, and this is good, it's giving him cover to realign and reposition toward China.
Which is what he says very explicitly, right? I mean, in his speech, he said that. And this is something I've been careful to qualify, along with the fact that the drone war will continue. That there may not be a meaningful, aside from the fact that they've effectively handed over the country to the Taliban, which I think will probably reduce the total drone strikes. That for the average random person in Afghanistan, there may not be a meaningful difference, because they're still going to have to worry about death from above, which is a very real fear, and it creates generational PTSD and all this other horrible stuff. But the sort of pivot to China is how Jake Sullivan framed it. And I think the national security consensus world wanted their cake and eat it too. They're like, well, we can do both. I mean, just this past week, we tacked on another $38 billion to the NDA that Biden didn't even ask for. That's 3 times adjusted for inflation. That's roughly that's about $10 billion more than the entire Israeli military budget, just randomly thrown in without any public debate or discussion. I mean, maybe a handful of articles, right? And so Biden really thought that that they had to sort of look at this as a focus issue. And make no mistake about it, one of the primary arguments people make, especially when they're not doing the sanctimonious fake moralizing about human rights, is that you need to remain in Afghanistan because of its proximity to China.
What, you're going to take away troops from the border of
Tajikistan and Iran?
Of Tajikistan. Everyone, oh my goodness, how can you do this? This is a disaster.
1,000 CNN reporters scrambled to go find an atlas to see what evil country was bordering Afghanistan we had to menace. But Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and others, they explicitly argue that this is about sort of pivot to China. I mean, anyone who can look at a hockey stick graph of development, growth, power, can see that that's the threat to U.S. sort of unilateral hegemony, which is sort of a no-no. It's not acceptable. We're the city on the hill. It's our world. We're supposed to sort of go wherever we want, whenever we want to. And China is obviously, there's a lot of people. There's a very large, very robust economy. It's very intertwined to some extent with our economy in certain sectors, and it has a leadership that is not going to sort of do whatever the U.S. wants them to do. It's a combination of creating space for capitalism, but also has an old guard of, and even to some extent a new guard of doctrinaire Marxist-Leninist leadership that has always been a weird hybrid. We don't have to go into the sort of details of it, but they're not going to go the way of the Soviet Union, basically, right? That's been clear for many years now. They're not going to just do the shock doctrine and bring in the sort of NGOs and try to make it some kind of vassal state of U.S. capital. And they're not fucking around, and they know that. And so there's this whole panic around that, Chinese influence. And John Cena did a TikTok, so let's melt down about that for fucking three months. And it's popular. It's bipartisan. I mean, the right, it's all they talk about. It's all the J.D. Vance talks about. It's all Josh Hawley talks about. It's the commies. It's just warmed over John Bircherism, but this time with a kind of more racist flair. Not to say that Birchers weren't racist, but I mean with respect to the Soviet Union, it's kind of has an added element. And so no, they've made that clear from day one that was the kind of, that was their pitch to the blob. Again, a term I'm not totally comfortable with because the person who coined it, Ben Rhodes, is probably one of the worst actors of the blob.
It's an interesting sleight of hand.
Yeah,
there.
Sort of
I'm not one of these people.
Was under Obama, because again, you can look at a chart. I mean, you can look at where the big arrows are going up. This isn't
the line is going in the wrong direction in this case.
And,
now.
There's a lot of imperial neurosis about that. There's, and how we're, in China's serving as an alternative to IMF, which is a huge, the IMF, structural adjustment programs and loans are a huge part of how the U.S. wields power in the global South and extracts resources and privatizes certain markets and fights commies.
Which is hilarious. It's hilarious too, because then you see people talking about like the Belt and Road Initiative and talking about it like they call it a debt trap, and it's like that's literally our thing. That's what we've been doing.
Without it's not like the Chinese debt mechanisms are necessarily benevolent or even that good, but what appears to be the case is that for the most part they're preferable, and that's why the IMF is now over the last 10 years or so has tried to get less exploitative. Look back in the 90s when there was no competition at all. It was a fucking protection racket. If you look at the data, I spent some time in Lebanon. If you look at the data, at least from 2018, I think the 25% of Lebanon's federal spending goes to paying off IMF loans. Something like 10% just goes off to paying interest alone. This was your only option if you needed to quote unquote develop and you had no other choice.
I always like to use the Nelson Mandela analogy too for this. That was how they prevented Mandela from carrying out a lot of the more radical reforms that he wanted to do when Mandela took over in South Africa, the land reform and all that stuff. Like he was completely hamstrung by the IMF debt that he had to pay to that the previous government, the apartheid government, had racked up.
Yeah, no, it's a protection racket. That's always been the criticism of it, and they don't want competition. That's what it's about. Everything else is window dressing. They don't want competition, and so that's where the focus is. And of course, the problem with that, there are many problems with that. If you look through the NDAA. Over the last 2 years, the rationalism. Russia sort of doesn't quite have the oomph. So that boogeyman doesn't really work. The war on terror is kind of played out. So every single rationalization of new ice cutters, aircraft carriers, whatever sort of $1 billion expenditure or $1 trillion war budget is justified by China. That's the new thing. So it makes sense that. Because I think there were some people in the Pentagon who sort of wanted to move away from Afghanistan for that reason. Because Afghanistan was a huge, huge, huge gravy train. It was a huge gravy train. There was an article, I think, where was it? Forgive me for not knowing. But it was basically about how Afghanistan basically developed and gentrified Virginia, the suburbs of D.C. They traced all the money from Afghanistan, $70-80 billion a year. The vast majority, 3/4 of it goes back to Virginia, goes back to California, goes to Connecticut, goes to New York, and undermining that gravy train is not good. But there will be other gravy trains, with the quote unquote pivot to Asia.
Yeah. And just to close off talking about Afghanistan too, one final thing that I found kind of interesting as well is that, as much as the media was really in overdrive trying to manufacture this narrative about how human rights are being abandoned and and all this stuff, like all this crap. And then they close out this occupation with a drone strike in retaliation for the suicide bombing that took place at Kabul airport. To, this retaliatory drone strike, Biden said, we're going to find you and we're going to take you out, and the tough talk that we're used to hearing. And then it's like, oh, by the way, that wasn't actually an ISIS camp that we took out. That was an aid worker and a bunch of kids and families. And like, it's really like, it becomes difficult then for the media to continue building this narrative. This one grotesque incident really became kind of a symbol of what the whole occupation was about, and punctured this idea, this myth that they had been creating, that America and Afghanistan or everyone else is standing up for people's human rights and defending people. I mean, it was one final piece of evidence that shows that none of that was ever really true.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one of the reasons there was a meltdown is that there was the way it works. And I talked about this a little bit on the Dig, the Jacqueline podcast, but basically the way it works is you sort of you do your and Gopal's piece in the New Yorker that went viral. Viral makes it sound frivolous. It was a wonderful piece of journalism. Forgive me for using that word in that context. Is that he shows that there's this rural-urban divide. That for most of the victims of the war are kind of faceless poor people, and the rural, 80% of the country is rural, right? It's not in Kabul. And the journalists pretty much only see Kabul, and they get the NGO tour, and they get the women's rights, and they sort of begin to believe it. And to some extent, it's true. It is preferable, by any objective metric, to live not under the Taliban if you're a woman in Kabul, of course. But the problem is it's a ledger, and the other part of the ledger is the massive amounts of death, vast majority of which it appears is not even documented, of people being killed by airstrikes, drone strikes, and being extorted by these warlords and militias and death squads the U.S. backs. And that was completely erased from the equation because, for the most part, journalists, they don't really get that story. They're not interested in that story. They're interested in the story that the U.S. is Emily's list with Predator drones, because that's a flattering story. It's a jingoistic story. It's also the story they're exposed to when they do their 6 months in Afghanistan to kind of earn their street cred, and that's what's fed to them by think tanks that are all funded by weapons contractors, et cetera, et cetera. So nobody really wanted to kind of address the messy part of the moral calculus, which is how bloody and how horrible this war has been for Afghan civilians. I mean, just documented alone, almost 10,000 deaths last year, and tens of thousands of deaths just go sort of glossed over with this image of women's education and such. And again, it's not as if those things aren't important, but they're just the only thing we talk about. We don't talk about the level of death that we deal out, and the forces that we back in Afghanistan who do deal out death and extort people and grift money and steal money from people. We only get the other side of the equation, which is why most people were so shocked to read the piece in the New Yorker, because they were saying, well, wait a second, what is this? And it's like, well, yeah, you literally never get that story. And it's there are reasons why that is in terms of access and how much exposure, but there's just this. You had this narrative that NATO was doing this women's liberation action, because in some sort of micro context it was true, sort of, but the reality of the situation was, if I'm a 7-year-old girl killed in a drone strike, being able to be educated doesn't mean much to me. And if you look at polls of Afghans, which the Asia Society, which is kind of a NED carve out anyway, it's sort of a pro-US based carve out, but poll after poll after poll showed that people just wanted the war to end. They didn't actually really necessarily care again, it depends how you ask the question, who won. They just wanted it to end because they were tired of the death and the fighting, which makes sense, right? It means 20 years is a long time. Entire generation of people grew up and this is all they knew. And unfortunately, the U.S. was never going to win. The U.S. was never going to militarily defeat the Taliban, because that was never going to happen.
If people cared about the well-being of Afghans, they would have spoken up or demonstrated a collective outrage years ago. As the bodies piled up and as people were killed, it was just a collective silence. And within that, and especially the media coverage of that and the terminology set forth by the government, the Bush administration especially, rolling out collateral damage to kind of dismiss innocent civilians killed by the military. The jingoism present throughout our media reduces these people to, subhuman levels where their lives just don't matter, their deaths don't matter. And when we saw these kind of self-aggrandizing or self-pitying lists of all the sacrifices that the United States made in Afghanistan, you never saw within that reflected a total body count of Afghans, whether they were actually, militants or civilians caught in crossfire or wayward drone strikes or anything. It was just always a bunch of, a couple thousand U.S. service members died. A couple dozen reporters died. We spent all this money, we spent all this time there, and then they never really mentioned the human loss there. And for people to act like this is about women's empowerment or some sort of gender or sexual equity, and that was their mission, is ludicrous. And I can't say I'm surprised.
You have to have a moral framework for empire. Every empire's had it. The British had a civilizing mission. They had their own internal propaganda. They had the propaganda they gave. Again, another example I talk about is like the women's empowerment and getting rid of child marriage was a primary argument to justify British imperialism in India to sort of fend off the Mohammedans. And this is sort of 101 stuff, right? Because tens of thousands of people have to wake up every day in the Pentagon. Millions of people in the Pentagon, but tens of thousands of people in the State Department, these sort of auxiliary NGOs that form around this. They have to wake up and believe that what they're doing is right. People don't wake up in the morning, some low-level functionary at the State Department, when they're not getting Havana syndrome. They don't wake up at 8 a.m. going, man, I really like to do empire, right? And twiddle their mustache. They need a moral pretext. This has been true of every war. Vietnam liberating people from communism, whatever it is, Korea. We're going to kill 20% of the population, but hey, they're not communists. Better dead than red. So Afghanistan retconned this kind of feminist posture that again, I think in certain quarters, there are people kind of lower down the food chain in the NGO world who really kind of wanted to do good and thought they were doing good. The problem is that it exists within a very cruel and it turns out disingenuous imperial context. And you saw this from a lot of frustrated NGO types and activists and feminists within Afghanistan when the U.S. was pulling out. They were outraged. They were being sold out. They were being, there was very little communication with respect to getting them out and doing this. And it's like, well, yeah, because they don't really care. I mean, I'm not trying to be glib about it, or kind of being. It's not about. The lack of sincerity matters because it reflects and follows through, and it reflects on what the real point of the mission is. And really what it was comparable to like an Exxon giving 5% of their profits to, alternative energy research. It's PR. And the fundamental existential nature of Exxon is sinister, just as the fundamental existential nature of U.S. empire is not for liberal progress. It's we know that because if that was their concern, tomorrow they would stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, but they don't. They paused it for 5 minutes, but ended up doing it anyway. So like that's how we know they're not really sincere, and in ethics, intent matters, as they teach you in 101. I think that moral framework is necessary. It has to emerge. And one of the things with Iraq is they couldn't quite get one. At first it was freedom, then they kind of tried the women's liberation thing, but that didn't really work, and then it was. Building a society. They couldn't really sink their teeth into a moral narrative of why we were going over there and bombing these people, 5,000-7,000 miles away. Especially
when all evidence that they were actually tied to any attacks on America had completely failed to materialize.
A revenge narrative. There wasn't really even a national security narrative, which again was originally the main narrative. And then it was, we're actually going to free them from this dictator. Well, okay, that seems kind of convenient.
By the way, don't look into how this dictator got there in the first place. No, definitely don't look into any of that stuff.
That's the old black and white days. We don't talk about that. That's basically a million years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Adam, while we still have you, I know you have to go in a few minutes. I just wanted to get your thoughts on another kind of media narrative that's been going on in mainstream media in America as well over the last couple of months, which is this idea of the work shortage and that no one wants to work anymore, the labor shortage narrative, which I know you've been covering a lot as well, which just seems very important to point out, getting to this moment in America when now these unemployment benefits are ending, you have evictions resuming. It's turning into this complete nightmare scenario for people that are being left behind by the economic system. And like, that is not really being talked about that much in the media. And what is being talked about is like the poor small business owners that are not able to get anyone working at their jobs. And it's been really relentless over the last like 6-8 months. Right. And you've covered this stuff a lot.
It's very clear that the strategy from both parties' leadership is to just move on. And that temporary aid pandemic is over because the vaccines didn't quite have the punch we thought they would with respect to stopping transmissions, and we can't. The capital class can't really permit us to allow people to freeload much longer because there's upward pressure on wages, and wages are too high. And the fundamental thing you have to understand is that our economy is so very much driven by precarity, fear of being destitute, fear of losing your apartment, fear of losing your health care. Is how the ruling class disciplines workers in this country. And when you have too much supplemental health insurance and stimulus checks, you've radically undermined that social contract, and you tilt from 99% of the power to capital to like 80%, and that's not acceptable. So you had people who are making $900 a week sitting home, and you can't have that, because then they could flourish and read and be happy and spend time with their children. And maybe pursue other interests, or maybe go back to school, and that's not okay. And it was very, very important to the Chamber of Commerce and the National Restaurant Association. These other business interest groups made it very clear to the Biden administration. They made it very clear to members of Congress, and this is uniform across Capitol. I mean, not without exception, especially those who rely on cheap, precarious labor, that this had to end. And it didn't matter if we had an uptick in cases. It didn't matter. The Delta variant totally changed the dynamic from May of 2001 when they started auctioning off this labor shortage bullshit. Because the labor shortage crisis was first and foremost an informal capital strike. It was people saying, it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other organizations saying we have to demagogue and go to the media and cry about having to pay people too much. Because it's not a labor shortage. A labor shortage implies a lack of workers. There was not a lack of workers. There was a lack of pay. It was a pay shortage because creating unemployment does create higher wages. That's what happens because you're basically competing with federal subsidies, right? And they said, okay, we're going to kind of eat shit a little bit, close early, maybe don't have as much employment as we need, but we're going to basically wait this thing out because it's going to expire in September, which it did. Because if they had to increase wages to keep up with the upward pressure on wages, they would have set a precedent, and they would have had to have paid those wages for the next few years, if not decades, and that was not okay. So instead, what they did is the capital lobbies, like again the local and national chambers of commerce and the National Retail and Association, National Restaurant Association, all these groups basically fed these stories to the media to find mom and pop small business owner, the sort of guy who owns the small diner in Appleton, Wisconsin, who just can't find waiters and his heart bleeds, and who's gonna pose this guy? And they had
you've got retirees going in just working, with just volunteering
10,000 of these stories, and eventually that provides the sort of cover. Republicans started gutting unemployment, of course, on the state level many months ago. Democratic governors quietly followed suit, and then eventually the Biden administration did, despite the fact that the federal unemployment insurance subsidies were the most popular program the Democrats have done in years, and it was the most meaningful transfer of wealth to the poor in probably 50, 60 years, since Medicaid and that or Medicare rather, and that was telling about what the Biden administration and Democratic leadership strategy was, which was to basically do, albeit with the caveat of vaccines, which is a huge caveat, but basically do what Trump wanted to do and what Greg Abbott wanted to do, which is that we're just going to kind of act like this thing doesn't exist, because the economy simply cannot have another 2-3 years of people living on the government kit. That was not okay. That because that undermines the whole social contract. It has to be, it's temporary pandemic insurance. Well, wait a second. The pandemic's still raging, right? I mean, I know, vaccines help, but the cases are up, hospitalizations are up. We have the winter coming. Doesn't matter. We're just going to move on. That's it. Sorry. Fuck you. That's it. We did the year and a half. That's all capital was willing to sustain. And to there was all this talk about inflation and this and that. So the pandemic did not stop, but the pandemic aid stopped. 7.5 million people, some say 9.3 million, depending on how you are thrown off their major financial lifeline overnight. 3.5 million people, according to Goldman Sachs, are facing a potential eviction over the next few months because they have this back pay they have to pay. You have state subsidies, but it's not being distributed. There's supposedly $45 billion in federal subsidies for paying back rent, but it's less than 2%'s gone out. Certain states, it's even less. You have a perfect storm, and basically nobody cares because what they're going to do is now wages are going to go back down, and they're going to tell everyone, well, you can't pay rent, go fucking drive an Uber. That's pretty much your option in that little brief window where you had a little bit of respite. And we have the numbers. The numbers are absolutely dispositive. We know that it reduced poverty and it reduced childhood hunger significantly. We actually saw a reduction in poverty and hunger in 2020 because of those UI subsidies. And to be clear, those UI subsidies don't cover millions of people. They don't cover informal workers, undocumented immigrants, informal economy, sex workers, etc. So they're not perfect, but they did reduce poverty. And that was definitely not okay. So we have a documented, known anti-poverty program that reduces hunger, reduces childhood hunger. Was more popular than Jesus and Tom Hanks, and it didn't matter because we had to go back to this social arrangement where people are constantly paranoid that they're going to lose their job and be destitute and be kicked out, and that was not okay.
Yeah. And, we saw a lot of grandstanding from liberals and from the Biden administration saying we reduced poverty, reduced childhood hunger and all the stuff you're saying, but leaving out the fact that these are all temporary things that are not going to, that are not permanent things, and all the poverty and child hunger is indeed going to be coming back.
That's the beauty about being a leftist or socialist or whatever, is you say well, if it's reducing poverty, let's just do more of that. This isn't, you don't have to do all these exotic fucking tweaks to the economy to calibrate the needs of capital with this and upward, and tax incentive. No, just give people fucking money. It's not that hard. But of course that's not okay because that's not that's not the foundation of this country.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to go, Adam. Thanks so much for coming to break this stuff down. And yeah, it's I think it's the work that you do on Citations Needed and elsewhere is really, really valuable for understanding the way these media narratives work and what the purpose is and what the goals are. So really appreciate you taking the time. Before we sign off, just want to let everyone know where they can find the podcast and the newsletter and everything you want to plug.
Yeah. So Citations Needed is a podcast, Citations with an S. You can find it on finer podcast providers everywhere. We're starting our 5th season on September 15th. It's every Wednesday. So we're excited about that. Episode 144, I think. I don't know. I'm losing track. I'm getting old. And then I started a Substack where I write 3 or 4 times a week. Media criticism. That's The Column. It's a rather presumptuous name. If not, I thought delightfully generic. The column.substack is in the newspaper column. The column.substack.com. That's where I will be writing. Which I like. I enjoy it actually. When I do my subtle slow drift to soft anti-vaxxism and right-wingism, I'll let you guys know ahead of time.
Sure, let's go. Yeah. Thank you. We'll make sure we get your Tucker appearances on. We make sure we tape it.
It's about free speech. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, exactly. All right, take care, and thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to The Insurgents. Please remember to subscribe over at theinsurgents.substack.com. Find the podcast on all your favorite podcast apps, and please remember to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's very helpful, and we appreciate it a lot. But please, again, don't mention Ken Klippenstein in the review. He is banned from the show. It's a lifetime ban, so please do not mention him in the review. And we'll be back later this week with more of the content that you know and love. Goodbye.